Hola, yo soy Untitled Chaparro. Les damos la bienvenida a la presentación de la traducción al español del libro más reciente de Joan Scott, Sexo y Secularismo. Esta presentación será en inglés y contaremos con el trabajo de interpretación simultánea de Flor Montero. Si desean escuchar esta plática en español, hay dos opciones: el canal de YouTube del Centro de Investigaciones y Estudios de Género de la UNAM y el canal de YouTube del Colegio de México. Para escucharnos en inglés, el Colegio de México también ha habilitado un canal en YouTube. Personal del CIEC se va a encargar de hacerme llegar sus preguntas y comentarios, así que por favor escríbanos en el chat. Y ahora, I switch to English. Publishing a book should always be an excuse to celebrate. We celebrate the academic effort, the hard work, curiosity, and rigor, and even the fury that leads scholars to engage with a topic in order to think it thoroughly and come up with novel ideas. Joan Scott has eloquently spoken about the importance of guaranteeing academic freedom as a matter of principle. Academic freedom, in Joan's words, refers to teachers and the knowledge they produce and convey. It seems easy, right? Nonetheless, we live in times of uncertainty, where anti-intellectualism has become a threat to many academic endeavors. Anti-intellectualism has to do with denying the authority of knowledge and experts alike. We must fight back, and we do that through our work. Books like this one are an expression of academic freedom. They urge us to question, to engage in critical thinking with others, and to challenge our own beliefs. Thus, today, we celebrate. For the Center of Research and Gender Studies at UNAM and the Interdisciplinary Gender Studies program at COMEX, it is an honor to host this presentation. We are also beyond thrilled to have Joan Scott herself here with us this evening, as well as COMEX research professor, historian Gabriela Cano, and from CIEC Research Associate Ali Siles. We have divided the presentation in three main parts. In the first part, our guests will talk about what the work of feminist historians entails, that is, questions on choices, methods, and approaches. The second part will address issues on secularism, laïcité, gender, and the state. And the third part will be dedicated to what we have called the future of gender. Then we will open the floor for questions from the audience. So we begin with the first question. How are you guys?
Good.
Fine, yeah.
Ready to go.
Very happy to be here.
Yes,
Yes, great.
I'm really not only happy to be here, but really pleased at the translation of this book, at the beautiful cover that has been produced for it, and grateful to you for organizing this event. Even if I couldn't come to Mexico, at least I get some sense of connecting to all of you tonight. So thank you for that.
No, thank you, John, for accepting our invitation. I don't know if Gabriela or Ali would like to come up with the first question or some thoughts in regards to the work of feminist historians. Gabriela?
Yeah. You're muted.
Yeah.
Okay, I was muted, but now I'm unmuted. I'm very, very happy to be here and to be discussing this new book in Spanish. I was just remembering with the colleagues in the panel that Joan was in Mexico City almost 11 years ago, and now there is greater interest in her work as we are living through a phase of intense activism in Mexican feminism and in Latin American feminism. And I hope we have a lot of questions and participations from all of you who are there on the other side of the screen. For the first topic of Joan's work as a feminist historian, I think that 11 years ago we wouldn't have underscore the fact that she presents herself as a feminist historian, because in academia well, I cannot speak for Latin America, but academia in Mexico, in the past year, feminist has become a word that is widely used, that is not something that one says in a low voice, but that can be proclaimed. That has changed, and that is good. Now, I also want to mention that Joan Scott, the Joan Scott, is really famous for an article she wrote and published some years ago, Gender and the...
Is gender a useful category of historical analysis?
Thank you, Joan. We read it in class, it's referred over and over. But there is much more to Joan Scott's work. And I find that she has developed and gone through an intellectual path that follows, though she has changed her view on gender, but from the very first formulations she called to interrogate larger concepts, broader concepts such as secularism, such as men and women, such as universalism. And I want to mention another of my, well, all of Joan's books are my favorites. I was going to say one of my favorite books, but in English it's called Only Paradox to Offer. In Spanish it's called El Feminismo y los Derechos del Hombre. It was published by Siglo XXI. I find a lot of connections with the book we are presented today, because while Only Paradoxes to Offer, she genders universalism, and in this book she makes gender interrogations to secularism. And I find that this is really eye-opening, and that this is very relevant for understanding the operations of gender. And as we are having this conversation, I thought to ask you, Joan, is there a research method you can sort of scheme out for these two particular books or for other of your work? I mean, I would like to go to your reading of E.P. Thompson, which is another one of my favorite pieces, but I will leave it tonight for Only Paradoxes to Offer and Sex and Secularism.
It's interesting that you pick Only Paradoxes to Offer too. I think that's my favorite book too. You know, if there are books in which I can still remember when I figured out the argument of that book, and it's not the case for other books. I mean, you remember things about other things you write, but you know, when you have that eureka moment of excitement that you've seen something that you hadn't seen before, and in that, I mean, just to remind people maybe that in that book, I think that to answer your question about the methodology of if there's a feminist critical methodology, I think for me, it's to take what we assume we already know and ask questions about it, problematize it, ask what work those assumptions are doing to secure our ideas about, in this case, gender, men and women, the secular and the religious. And in Only Paradoxes to Offer, I looked at the way in which, at least among American, Anglo-American, and French feminists too, there was this notion that there were two schools of feminism: equality feminism and difference feminism. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought that that equality difference opposition was actually the wrong way to think about feminism and the history of feminism. Because as I thought about the feminists I had worked on in French history, they were always doing both. They were always demanding equality and talking about difference. And it was very hard to separate the two things. And so I went back to my favorite of some of those French feminists over the period of time from the French Revolution until when women get the vote at the end of World War II. And I looked at a different woman for each period, one who was supposed to be equality, one who was supposed to be difference. And I, in effect, in the formal sense of deconstruction, I deconstructed the opposition between equality and difference. And I said, if there is a problem about what side you're on, equality or difference, it doesn't have to do with feminism or feminism's mistakes or inability to argue logically. It has to do with the argument that they're trying to make in the face of liberal notions of democratic representation. That is, what does it mean to be a citizen? And how do you get to be a citizen if you're a woman? And if, as was the case throughout French history, the citizen was defined as male or masculine, then how could you say, I am the same as you if you were a woman? So even to ask for equality meant saying, we women demand equality, either because we're as reasonable or smart or able as you are, or because we bring to the table different qualities that you need in order to create a reasonable society. And so it was the fact that the argument had to be made in terms of a theory of politics that defined equality as sameness and citizenship as masculine, that meant for women to argue for equality meant there was no way not to invoke their difference. And you find over and over again, whatever the specifics, they're saying, we women, in the case of Olympe de Gouges, the first French revolutionary woman I mentioned, we who are braver in childbirth than men will ever be in war, you know? So what is she saying there? We're the same. In fact, we're better than you, but also we're different. And so how do you negotiate that equality difference argument? And the argument of the book was, it's in some ways less interesting to put women, feminists in schools, of equality schools and different schools, than to ask the question of why that difference comes up, why that opposition comes up in the first place. So, and I think I had a similar critical thinking about secularism, particularly after I wrote the book on the veil, on the politics of the veil in France, those laws outlawing the wearing of Islamic headscarves in public schools. When I finished that book, I thought, what kind of work is the notion of laïcité, secularism, doing in French society? Not what is secularism, which is what the politicians were looking to define all the time, but what work is this concept doing? And that led me to go back to a huge body of literature, which is what this book, the secularism book, depends on, to say there's this long history of second wave feminism history, which says, look, democracy has not always been democracy for women. Secularism has not always been meant equality for women. The long struggle for feminists to have the right to vote, and then after that, the right to be elected to office, the right still to have equal wages. I don't know, yesterday there was an article in the New York Times that reported that Princeton University had decided to settle with a group of women who were suing because their pay was significantly less on average than men's pay. So it goes on, these sort of inequalities. So the point is, I think the point about what I consider feminist history, and it's linked to the notion, to Michel Foucault's notion of the history of the present, That is, what you do is you look at concepts that you take for granted as explaining what you need to know, and ask what work they are doing to establish relationships of power, to keep in place or legitimize organizations of society, usually hierarchical, in the ways that they have always been. So I think if there's a methodology, it's asking troubling questions about things that we ordinarily take for granted.
Okay, thank you.
Ali, do you want to follow up on that, or another question?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'd like to say I'm also really thrilled to be here. That article that Gabriela mentioned that Joan wrote a few years back, it was actually my start in when I became interested in gender. It was the first kind of, my gateway into gender studies. So I have always thought of it, of gender as a historical kind of perspective, really, because of that.
Right.
So, one thing that I think was precisely about the concepts we tend to take for granted and stuff. And this was part of a pretty kind of discussion that we were having about what kind of points could be discussed in this this discussion. And we're talking about the title itself, the title of the book, and how you decided to go with something as sex and secularism rather than gender and secularism. I thought that was an interesting choice, and I would like to see if you could, share a little bit about that.
Sure. Just to go back to your point about the article, the gender article, gender itself is another example of what I was talking about in answer to Gabriela. That is, gender, when I first wrote the article, Gender, a Useful Category of Historical Analysis, it had a question mark at the end. The article was called, Is Gender a Useful Category of Historical Analysis? And the American Historical Review, which published it, said they didn't allow question marks in the title of a piece. And so the question was dropped. But the question mark is really important, I think, if you think about the interrogation of concepts that are taken for granted, which is what I was trying to do in that article. But the title of the book, I mean, at one level, I think it was a sexier title to just admit that. Because gender and secularism sounded boring. And a couple of my friends said that to me, and somebody said, well, call it sex and secularism. That'll get everybody, interested and excited. So that was part of it. And part of it too was that it was, in fact, sex itself that seems to me to be at issue in the question of gender. That what they're talking about in the various things that I cite in the different chapters in the book, whether associating women with religion, whether talking about the primary role of women as reproduction, whether the reasons for excluding women from politics have to do with consolidating a certain image of masculinity as powerful. All of those things have to do with I lost my train of thought for a minute. All of them have to do with this is ridiculous. All of them have to do with the ways in which sex works to ground notions of gender. So it's not just the difference between women and men is being translated into social roles, political roles, religious or economic roles, but that the difference rests on a difference of sex based in nature that cannot be challenged or interrogated. And so, because my argument in the book is that the move from religious justifications for the differences of roles for women and men, two natural ones, biological ones, rests on the notion that sex is determining, and that sex is somehow, because it's natural, outside the possibility for social reform or social organization. So there's one point when I cite early on in the French Revolution, when women are banned from coming to political meetings, one of the orators stands up and he says, "Has nature given us breasts to feed our children? No. Since we don't have breasts, we're here, and you go home and take care of the children." And there's a wonderful moment later, 50 years later, in 1848, when the socialist feminist Jean de Rouen says, in reply, well, if it's breasts that define women out of citizenship, which of the physical organs of the body allows men to be legislators? And it's just, she's pointing exactly to the sort of psychological issue, but it's sex that is the ground on which all of these gender distinctions are built. And so it seemed to me not only a sexier title that would sell better, but also a more accurate description of the very basis upon which these arguments, these secularized arguments about the reasons for the differences between the hierarchical arrangement of the differences between women and men would be justified.
Right.
So
definitely. No, I agree. And I also think it's very compelling, this argument you're making about how secularism was able to incorporate precisely the sex difference and sexuality into it and naturalize it the way it has.
Yeah. No, the naturalizing of it is really, it's so amazing to watch. And I guess in that way, it's the chapter, the second chapter, the chapter on reproduction, the way in which these biologists come up with these amazing explanations for the reasons that the one guy who says, if among the primitive protozoa these differences are established, no act of parliament can change them. And so it becomes impossible for human intervention, however rational, however bureaucratic, however secular, it becomes impossible for human intervention in what nature has decreed.
I was thinking of this sex-gender tension, and would you say that it is more like sex is always gendered? Is that what you're saying? That sex is always sort of submerged into the forces of gender?
Even more than that, I think I would say that yes, the answer is yes to the question, but I would add to that, I think, that sex is not just submerged in the question of gender, but it is in fact gender that attributes meaning to the sexed body. Although the fact of the sexed body becomes the justification for gender. So there's this double play that goes on. Well, nature has decreed these differences, even though it's we who attribute to nature the meanings that we then use to justify gender. So it's how it plays back and forth. It's not, as originally second wave feminists argued, that sex was the basis upon which gender was determined, but in fact it's gender that refers to sex to justify the distinctions that it's making.
I was thinking of history of France and the French Revolution, and history of Mexico. And there are so many parallelisms in the way the liberals in the 19th century, but I cannot speak that much for the 19th century, but even into the mid 20th century, there are precisely the same arguments. In fact, it is paradoxical that Mexico, being the first country in Latin America to have a social revolution, however, it was one of the last ones to give the vote.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
it's very parallel to France, right?
Yes, yes, because it is a very late. It was the equal suffrage was established only in 1954, while in other, say in Argentina and Brazil, it was right after the Second World War. And I have been puzzling for a long time, why is this happening? And the sort of most general question is, well, because in Mexico, there is a stronger machismo. Well, yes. I mean, machismo is all over the world.
Yes, exactly.
But then after puzzling, well, for me, the answer is that the revolutionaries who were completely anti-clerical, they were radical in their anti-clericalism in ways, I'm not sure if it's the same as in the French revolutions, but they would sort of, in the most radical expressions, they would burn down altars and saints, and they were sort of interested in women's education just because if women were educated, they would say, then it would be more difficult for the church to control women.
Yep.
And it is, there are so many resonances, as I was rereading your chapter on Michelet and this triangle between the wife, the priest, and the husband. And it is exactly, I've read it in Mexican 20th century sources, not so much in this sort of triangle, but saying, well, if we're not careful, then women are going to be sort of under the priest's control. And where is my authority going to go? I mean, I will be somehow demasculinized.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, I mean, I think the parallel that you're making is very strong. And in the chapter, that first chapter on women and religion, I think there's an additional point, which is that in these anti-clerical discourses, and more generally in the discourse of secularism, even in Protestant countries, because clearly in Catholic countries, the power of the church is more dangerous to a secular state than in Protestant countries. And I think you could make the distinction generally, but then you're saying that even within Latin America and among Catholic countries, Mexico is slower to grant the vote. And I think that it has something to do with the specifics of church-state relations. But it also has to do with the way more generally women have been associated with religion as religion in these distinctions made between the private and the public, the affective, the emotional, the sensitive, and the reasonable and the rational, between the sort of domestic, the home, the reproductive, and the market, and the productive and the political for men. So that distinction, the public-private distinction, doesn't only say that women are on the religious side, it makes women and religion somehow equal. It feminizes religion, even as it religifies, if that's a word, women. So, and it's how that works that then leads to these anti-clerical denunciations of women and fear of women as importing into politics the teachings of the church. And And it's not just the teachings of the church, it's the power that the organized Catholic Church represents, the threat to a republic or democracy that it embodies, that is held in opposition. I mean, there are things in the French Revolution where anti-clericals talk about women as the whores of priests, you know, women as dangerous religious figures. It's sort of like, you know, the old witch trials of the 15th and 16th century, in which women represent the Satan for the church. They bring all of the dangers of anti-religion into the church. Now you have this flip in which women are now the church, the pawns of the priests, and because of their innate biological makeup, they're more sensitive, they're more passionate, they're less reasonable. We have to worry about their influence and restrain it. And giving them a vote would be the absolute antithesis of that. I start that chapter on religion with this wonderful quote from Hubertine Claire, this French feminist, who says, you know, what's wrong with these secularists using religious arguments to keep us out? And my answer is, well, these aren't religious arguments now. These have become secular arguments. And then she says, how can they keep us out when they let priests vote? It's hypocritical, you know. Women can't vote because they're under the thumb of the priests, but priests can vote. Why? And of course she says, because they're men. And I found that a wonderful sort of feminist argument against what is a secular contradiction or inconsistency around the question of religion and women.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, I think we are kind of navigating towards our second section of the talk today, which has to do with precisely these concepts that are so rich within the book, the notion of secularism and the choice of secularism over laïcité. Maybe that's an important thing to discuss here as well. And just a quick note gathering on what you have all been saying. It just seems very paradoxical that no matter where, women just don't get to win, right? Like there's always this other imposition, structural and institutional, that place women and reduce them to their nature or their apparent nature, and that discourse doesn't seem to go challenge. You know, it goes, it runs along the centuries unchallenged, and even in projects that are supposed to be ethical and forward and avant-garde. So I don't know if Ali and Gabriela would like to pose some comments or questions on the notions of secularism and the things that we have been discussing, but in order to enter into this second part.
Just to sort of go into this second part, it's in your pointing out, I think very rightly, that plus ça change, as the French would say, the more things change, the more they remain the same, that you get the progress, you get the right to vote, you get the right to divorce, but then there's as in recent years, Me Too has shown, the problems continue, they move over into different places. But I think there, and in the chapter on politics, I raised this question. I think there, turning to psychoanalysis is not a bad idea. That is, looking at the ways in which a commitment to, or the understanding of masculinity as associated with power, or power as associated with masculinity, is deeply rooted in our psyches, our psychology. You know, when there was a king, he was the representative of God on earth. He wielded the phallus, and the phallus was the symbol of power. And the phallus, of course, comes to be associated with the penis, with masculinity. And then when the king is gone, and the brothers take over. Democracy in some form or another comes into being. The question of what is now the symbol of power is left uncertain. You know, there's no one body who is the state, who is the ruler, who is the power. And so what happens, and Freud argues this, Lacan argues this, others argue this, is that the association of power, the phallus, with the male organ becomes more pronounced, and men understand themselves as the sons of the king, who they've killed him, but they're now in charge. And the sort of the fights about who rules have everything to do with who has the organ that enabled the king to have his power. It's a kind of strain. It's the biologization, the sexualization of politics and political power. And that means that in order to maintain that myth, women have to be kept out, because women, as Lacan argues, it's women's recognition of that power, women's desire for men, but women's recognition of that power that establishes its validity. And so the importance for men, for masculinity, of a certain kind of dominance over women, and of women's acceptance of that dominance, is psychically very much ingrained, I think, in our social organization, at least in Western forms of this. And I think that goes a long way to explain these continuities that, you know, you think to yourself, what more can we do to change these things? You know, the sort of the awful embodiments of that association of masculinity with power are someone we're living with right now, is someone like Donald Trump, who surrounds himself with these Barbie doll women, you know, all of whom are his. He's like what Freud calls the primal father. He gets to have all the women, not just one, including, you know, all those comments he made about his daughter at some point. You know, if she weren't my daughter, wink, 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 I would. He makes the law, but he's above the law. He doesn't have to enforce, doesn't have to be held to account by the law. So there's some way in which he's a kind of exaggerated, horrific example of this notion that masculinity and physical, the physical possession of masculinity is what entitles him to power and what marks his power, however, you know, empty and crazy and stupid he is. So I think there is a way in which those psychoanalytic explanations help you see that there are these undercurrents of influence that are not easily overturned by legal reform, although legal reform is tremendously important and we need it. It doesn't do the trick completely.
I was thinking about the increase in violence against women that we're living in many countries, in Mexico among others, and sort of let me see if I can say this, following this kind of argument, I would be able to, it would be possible to think this violence as this brotherhood being sort of reinforced because it was challenged, because women were, which is one of the explanations of the continuity of violence against women, is that women gained spaces, had some power, and then you have this sort of response trying to discipline them.
Right. Yes, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. And it's not only it's we have to say it's not all men. We're not including you, and there are many men. We're not talking about every man in the world. No, I'm thinking of my son, my grandchildren. We're not talking about all men, but we're talking about these concepts of masculinity that have a powerful hold on populations that are linked to exercises of power. And it's that link, I think, that you want to explore. But yeah, I mean, the violence against women that is increasing is, I think, precisely a response, a backlash against feminist gains, including most recently the Me Too movement, which unveiled for all to see these abuses of power that just have gone on and on and on, despite, in the United States, Title IX, the anti-sex discrimination legislation, despite laws of all kinds about sexual harassment and so on. So yes, I think it is about the assertion of masculinity and the protection of it as somehow threatened by women gaining space. It's like it's a zero-sum game. If women gain space, men are going to somehow lose. And you have these crazy guys. I don't know if you have them in Mexico, the incel guys, the guys who can't find dates with women, who go out and kill women because they're refusing to respond to them, or they're somehow the entitlement of men to sexual relations with women has been refused by feminist movements, and therefore feminists have to be punished by these men for having denied them that access, that entitlement.
Yeah, in fact, there's a recent book by Kate Mann on a called Untitled, and it has to do with this incel guy who commit crimes against women because they feel that their right to have access to their bodies has been denied. I would say that it's not the only expression of this backlash. I think there's also a thread in regards to public policy. I'm thinking about budget cuttings for projects like Planned Parenthood, or now in the US you have the whole Roe v. Wade dilemma. So it's in different ways, and that shows that even when women push further, there's always a backlash.
Yeah, and the backlash is more and less powerful depending on who's in charge, who is politically in charge. In our case, the Republicans have become the body, the vanguard of the protection of white masculine supremacy. It's as simple as that.
I was thinking about this precisely in what you said at the beginning and what you set out to do with the book, which is kind of interrogating the work, as you put it, the work that the concept as secularism does. And one of them, I would think, is precisely this, of kind of incorporating ways of subordination of women that reaffirm masculinity in a very natural way. Just like you're saying it right now, like, the exercise of power can be criticized to a certain extent, for example, in a character such as Donald Trump, because it's kind of exceeding that sort of a consensus, right? Like you can be, you can still be hyper masculine, if you will, but still look for kind of like attend to the natural sort of consensus that we have established through this idea of a secular society. For example, what you say in the book about how secularism has become synonym with women's sexual liberation, but it's a very particular kind of sexual liberation.
Exactly.
Because precisely what Gabriela was saying about violence, against women. A lot of it has to do with this, with an improper exercise of that sexuality. I mean, in the sense of the perpetrators of the violence, sometimes it's like this. So I think that's why I think it's a very good point that you make throughout the book, in how the secularist discourse, as you call it, has obscured many of these practices. And as you say, it gives a lot of room to understand those continuities that you've been talking about, and that Mary was also talking about, and Gabriela too.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. I was thinking when you were, I just have to, sorry. I'm sorry. I can't, the phone is in my office and I can't mute my thing because I'm in the middle of talking. What was I going to say? I think that what I was thinking was, while you were talking, on the other side of it was that it puts women who are interested in power or competing for power. Let me just, I can't talk now, I'm on a Zoom call. It puts women in a position of having to affirm a certain femininity at the same time as demonstrate their ability to be in the position of power. And what I was thinking of is, I don't know if you've heard her voice, but this candidate for the Supreme Court Justice position, Amy Coney Barrett. Have you heard her voice, any of you? She talks like a little girl. She sort of talks like this. There's something, when you hear her, you think, no. It's like, in addition to all of the terrible positions that she represents, it's that the need to sort of present herself as unthreatening, not dangerous. And it's in her voice that you hear it. It's really, but it is symptomatic of the dilemma that faces women who then aspire to positions of power, and particularly those kinds of positions of power, that is political, visible, high up positions of power.
I was thinking still on this violence, and I said violence against women, but actually I was thinking of extreme violence, actually feminicide, which is something that we are looking for every day, how it is increasing. And something that you say, look at the women, and I was thinking of the women who are part of the drug trade and that they have positions of power in the drug trade, and they do exercise the same kind of violence, but still it doesn't, it's sort of the other side of what were you telling Ali, it's not all the men, and there is some women that can be as cruel, these drug ladies. Some of them are very feminine, some of them are not. You have a whole different styles of femininity, but because people will give this example, but there are women who can be as violent and as cruel as
yes.
men.
I absolutely, and I don't think the explanation, the psychoanalytic explanation, explains everything by any means, nor, as I said before, are we talking about all men and all women, but about these patterns of inequality and hierarchy that persist despite these variations. So, no, I think you're absolutely right. There's no way that there's a kind of inherent femininity that makes women better, nicer, more subservient than men. Women can exercise power in the most masculine of ways, if we want to call it that. There's no biological difference that we could evoke in this. It has to do with forms of self-representation that are available and legible depending on the context and the situation. So in certain contexts, women can opt to be as powerful or try to be as powerful and as cruel and violent as men. And there's nothing to stop that. And there are, men who opt for more feminine styles of self-representation. Those are there. But when we're talking about these kind of large patterns of difference, we're inevitably making generalizations that don't apply in all situations, and certainly don't have to do with any inherent biologically driven qualities that determine the differences between women and men.
On this note, I don't know if the guests would like to say a little bit more about one of the key themes within the book that has to do with Islamophobia, and in particular, the sort of discourses that are around this issue that is the flag for Western civilizations that take on this quest against Islam, and in particular Islam's perception of women, without looking at what is happening in the West, which is basically what we have been discussing, these notions of high violence against women, and the mistreatment and the threats and the forms of control of women's bodies. I don't know if Ali, Gabriela, John, you have any thoughts or specific questions on this issue, which is brilliantly addressed on the book?
Well, that was one of the motivations for the book, just to sort of put that out there. It was after I did I think I mentioned before, I did the book on the politics of the veil in France. It seemed to me that the issue of secularism needed more analysis. And what was clear to me is that there's this opposition that is being set up between the West and Islam, in which the West is said to represent women's emancipation and Islam women's oppression, to just put it as simply as possible. And that rests or circles around the question of sexual liberation. In the West, women are free to sleep with whomever they want. In the East, under Islam, women are veiled, repressed, and controlled sexually as well as socially. And what I argue is that it's that opposition that allows the West to paper over or ignore the inequalities that persist on our side. It's not a matter of saying Islam is perfect and we're not, just reversing the opposition, but saying, look, yes, there are problems there, but if we just think in terms of our freedom versus their non-freedom, we miss the fact that there are problems that we need to address that go unaddressed by continuing to insist that everything's fine here and they are the enemy or the danger. But that was the impulse for the book to begin with. Yeah, Ali, you had.
No, I was just thinking in those kind of interrogations become, I think, all the more relevant in a context like Mexico, where we have sort of a hybrid space between West and East, if you will. I mean, it's never been, Latin America was never construed as the Orient as such, as, for example, Said or those type of articulations propose. But in a way, or in many ways, it's not the West either. And there's a colonial past and all of this. And so you have these realities today kind of coexisting, I think, here. And so I think this sort of interrogation becomes a little more relevant when you think, how does this, or what can we learn from this juxtaposition of East-West not being resolved, as you say, or as Abney said, you very clearly and very in a very good way demonstrate in the book. How can we learn, or what can we learn from that for sort of a...
One question I would ask would be about indigenous populations in Mexico and more generally in Latin America. I mean, is there a similar othering of those populations as pre-modern, anachronistic, traditional, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
And is there a way in which gender is part of the story that's told about the difference between modern Latin American populations and indigenous ones? I don't know, because I don't know the history or the sociology well enough, but you would.
Yeah, well, I think there is a lot of that. I mean, recently, in the last, probably in Mexico particularly, since the breaking of the Zapatista movement, for example, where all this, all the, the discussion about the indigenous peoples was put on the table, and it kind of caught up a lot of attention. It caught a lot of attention. There's been a lot of talk of that, but even right now with the new government in place, who has tried to kind of hark back to indigenous people still from a very kind of exoticizing perspective, in my opinion. Like, there's ancestral knowledge there that we could retake, and all those sort of things. So I think there is a lot of that here. I wouldn't know about the rest of Latin America, but I mean, I don't know what the others think. But yes, Gabriela.
Well, I wasn't going to answer that question precisely about indigenous population, but I was thinking something that was suggested by, as I was rereading the book, was how this othering of Mexicans by the United States is there all the time. And saying, well, women are better in the United States. And you just began saying, well, I read in the New York Times as how a group of women professors in Princeton were fighting for having the same salaries. There has been sort of a legal equal salary for men and women since 1917 in Mexico. Not that it is followed, not that it is abided. I mean, it depends so much in the kind of work, and then there is domestic work and the private and the public, and there is the glass ceiling, and there are many restrictions for women to get into the same sort of positions that have better salaries, say engineers or mechanics, sort of those cultural restrictions. But according to the law, I mean, to the Constitution of 1917 and the Federal Labor Law of 1931, I mean, men and women are entitled to have the same salaries for the same work. So that's the sort of othering from this imperialistic view of the United States and how they see Mexicans as machos. And we do have some machos on the other side of the border, as you just mentioned. And I was thinking more about that. The situation with the indigenous populations is complicated, to say the least. And, but anyway, that's what came to my mind as I was listening to you.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think that the representations of Mexicans as well, in Trump's words, thieves, rapists, terrorists, is rampant. But there's not a religious piece to it in the same way that there is with the Muslims. I mean, it's not the secular versus the religious as it is with Muslims. It's, nobody's afraid that Mexicans are going to impose Sharia law on America. And you would be amazed at the number of states in this country in which there are now laws that say Sharia law cannot be imposed on the state of, whatever, Tennessee or Mississippi. I don't know which of the states there are. But So it's a different othering. It's an othering of class in more than it is of sort of secular versus religious.
But wouldn't you say that there is an element of Mexico being Catholic, and even sort of that in respect to women, that women are more domestic, they're more maternal, there are sort of
to some extent, but I mean, my sense, and you might be right, but my sense of the general discourse is more that it's more about class, and that all of you are, you know, lower class immigrants trying to sneak into this country and do illegal things. That it's the presenting of the laboring classes as the dangerous classes. Yeah. That's where the real argument, that's why we have to build a wall. You know, the position of women is less of an issue in the arguments that I think people like Trump are using than, and the anti-immigrant politicians are using, than the issue of a dangerous religious subversion of the country. Yeah, Ali.
And I think it's a similar thing, precisely what you're saying, with the sort of urban population precisely towards the indigenous communities in Mexico. It's a similar othering, you know, it's more in terms of the modern and the traditional. Or traditional as not as developed or underdeveloped. I think it's a similar thing. And I think that's also part of what I was trying to say about this sort of hybridity in which the context in which we find ourselves has. Because, yeah, on the one hand, we have this sort of, we're the object of this othering from, say, the North, the global North,
right.
and within ourselves, and even to South America. I don't know what the others would think, but I think we have a similar, other countries in South America, we tend to view them as in a similar light, like as, you know, not as developed or not as close to the United States, for example, as we. So, you know, it's just to kind of follow up on your question of the view of the indigeneity. I think that's kind of the othering that.
That's.
Just a quick reminder to the people, to those watching, that you could ask questions or post your comments on the chat boxes on YouTube, and also for those on Zoom, there's a Q&A option. So please write down your questions as we move towards our last segment, which is on the future of gender, which also draws on all these things that we have been discussing. And I think I like the way that the interviewee became the interviewer, that Joan has this curiosity about what is going on in Mexico, which is very complex, because, yeah, we create our other forms of otherness, and then we go back to these historical debates on what it is to what's at stake, or who should we be saving, the individual or the communities. What is the sort of clash of civilizations within hybrid countries or complex countries like this one, and I think that. Also, I'm not sure though if I completely got what you were saying, Joan, about this class divide, because I was thinking about the Black Lives Matter movement. That is obviously a movement that has to do with race, and in this sense, race is particularly connected to oppression and subordination that has to do with systemic forms of exclusion and inequality that has to do with economic, social, political inequality.
Absolutely.
So that's a key component. That race is a key component there, isn't it?
And I think race is a really important question. I think I make the distinction in the beginning about race and gender. You know, there are people who argue that race is more important than gender, and other people that gender, and again, that's one of those arguments I think is not helpful. But it does seem to me that there are two different issues. Race has to do with the othering of marked others, right? That Black people, Arabs, whatever we want to, Latinx, whatever we want to sort of mark as the others, those are external to some notion of who we are as a nation. But gender is internal to the social body or the political body. And so the interesting question is to ask is how those operate either together or how race is understood in terms of gender or gender in terms of race. But the question of gender pertains to sexual difference, and sexual difference is internal to the social body in a way that racial difference is typically not. They are the outside of who we are. But what are you going to do with these women who are the inside of who we are? So I think there are two different paradigms of exclusion, if you want to call it that. One having to do with the external others, the other having to do with the internal others. And I haven't sort of worked that through, but I think it would be really interesting for people for graduate students doing research on these questions to, instead of just talking about intersectionality, which assumes the two things go together, to ask how they actually are operating and what it means to sort of think gender as is the case with Islam. Gender is another way of establishing the otherness, the external otherness of these people. And what's the difference between that and an internal subordination of women in the of white women in the political sphere, and how that works, and how the question of the status, for example, of African Americans, of Black Americans, how that is argued as an internal or an external exclusion. How does that work? And again, I don't have answers to that, but those are the sorts of questions I think that playing the two together, but thinking in terms of the difference that gender and race establish in terms of exclusions, external and internal, matter. How that works would be a really interesting set of questions to bring to one's historical or sociological or ethnographic material.
I don't know if Gabriela or Ali have more questions.
Yes, the future of gender.
What is the future of gender? That is the question. Please answer.
I have something more specific about this, and I go back to what I said at the beginning, that we're living an intensity of young feminism in Mexico, and it is my impression that gender is being perceived as old-fashioned. It is more about feminism, and it is more about transgender. That's fine, but not gender. And I was reading some of the questions. It is really amazing how at some point some of these younger feminists, I don't want to use the word radical feminists at this point, but how they almost touch with very conservative positions on gender, like those that are the enemies of what they called the ideologies of gender. I'm talking about this sort of very right-wing positions that are usually close to the Catholic hierarchy. And strangely enough, I hear some young feminists saying, well, no, gender, that's something of the past. We're talking about feminism and about flexible queer identities. And what do you think of that?
Well, it worries me because I think of gender as a way of critically a tool of feminist critical analysis. And so it's not a matter of saying that it's not a matter of endorsing normative binary difference as explaining everything. It's a matter of saying, how does normative binary difference work to establish a common sense understanding of what it means to be a man or a woman, what it means to be heterosexual or homosexual. I mean, it's how does or even trans, what is going on what is going on that if you ask the right questions, enables you to see what these trends are responding to, what these movements are taking on as the issues that matter to them. So for me, the notion that gender is a theory that's seen its day I don't understand it, because for me, gender is a set of questions that I can keep asking about how representations of biological or sexual difference change, how they work as I used the term before, to create understandings of power differentials in societies. It doesn't seem to me that we could do without it. And I don't see what is gained by giving up on it. Gender is old-fashioned in the sense, only if you say what gender is a description of a fixed binary opposition that assigns roles to biological sex. But that's not the body of theory that I'm working with. And I think that many people who are looking to use gender as a critical way in to social and political history, social and political organization, I don't think that I don't think its time has passed. Let's put it that way. And it's worrisome that it is. I mean, there are a couple of. I think even the fact that trans is called transgender suggests that there's still something useful in the category that the trans is trying to surpass, but also is working in terms of. So that would be my answer to that. So yes, there's a future for gender, but it's my way of doing it.
Okay, Ali, do you have a follow-up question on this?
Not really. I mean, what I was thinking a little bit more was, and this is, I think, a shared kind of preoccupation, is has to do more with rather than the future of gender itself, is the future of religious movements and religiosity.
Yeah.
In today's societies today. Here in Mexico, for example, and in all of Latin America, we have had a very strong kind of evangelical sort of revival, and in the US as well. And that is actually kind of tied to precisely, these new groups in power. It's the case a little bit with Trump supporters. It's also a case with Bolsonaro in Brazil, and other movements like that. So I was just thinking, what do you kind of make of this as going into the future, and this relationship between sex and secularism? Is secularism kind of giving in to this new evangelical?
No, I don't think it. I mean, I don't think it. I think in the case of someone like Trump, or maybe even Bolsonaro, it's hypocritical. I mean, I think it's a way of signaling their approval of traditional arrangements of sexual difference, as well as of society, And if opportunistically it's the evangelicals who are going to give them the support to do that, they'll go for it.
Yeah.
But I also think that it does raise the question about whether or not something like my book is denouncing secularism. And I have to say that was my anxiety when I finished it. It was, the moment of Trump's election. It was the anti-abortion crusaders seemed to be on the rise. It was the international anti-gender movement inspired by the Catholic hierarchy, the Vatican, and things like that, and all over the world, that I thought, is this the time to be publishing a book that's critical of secularism? It's like, oh, what have I done? You just I had these terrible moments of enormous anxiety. But I think that what calmed me down were friends who said, you don't give up on critical work just because it seems to be, the concept itself seems to be under siege. In fact, what I would say is that in some ways, what the book wants to do is argue that there is some emancipatory aspiration that secularism embodies, that these revolutions promised, that is unfulfilled. And that until we look at the reasons for the failure to fully grant the kind of equality that one imagines, or that feminists want, or that one imagines for all races and sexes, that until that happens, you have to keep criticizing what is taken to be secularism, because you'll never get there otherwise. So it's in arguing against an appointment to the Supreme Court of Catholics who support who are opposed to abortion. You of course say this is a secular nation state, and that's not supposed to be that way. Church and state are not supposed to be together, and certainly the church is not supposed to be calling the shots for political policy. And you argue that very strongly, and I would argue that very strongly, which is not to say that everything in what now passes for secular nation states is perfect. So you're a critic on the one side, even as you aspire to the values and principles that are promised, but certainly not realized by the notion of what secularism is supposed to be, and in fact violated by the kinds of oppositions between the secular and the Islamic that I try to talk about some in the book.
Yeah, I guess one of the key issues is that secularism is informed by Judeo-Christian values. However, it makes a great effort, and it's quite successful in not showing them, right? But they are there to just become normalized within our set of values in the Western. And we think that everything that is against that is religious and is probably wrong. However, we are embedded in that sort of position, which is an ethical position in itself, but that doesn't mean it's not problematic. Sorry, Gabriela, you wanted to say something.
No, just thinking about the future, my question would be, what is the next book, Joan?
Well, I just published a book which has nothing to do with gender, which is called On the Judgment of History. It's out now. Yeah, it's just out. And it was a series of lectures I gave at Columbia University last spring, in the spring of 2019. And partly it was because I thought that in Sex and Secularism, I said everything I had to say about gender. It was like, okay, if I have to give a series of lectures, and I'll simply tell what I already said in this book, and I don't really want to do that. And the invitation came at the moment of the demonstrations in Charlottesville, Virginia, when Trump said, these were all very fine people and stuff. And my reaction to that was, wait a minute, these are people with Nazi flags. This is the Ku Klux Klan. Whatever happened to the judgment of history? I said to myself, weren't we done with this? What is it? And then so the book has 3 cases that look at the ways in which the notion of the judgment of history, that is coming to some closure on some evil of the past, does or does not work. And how does the notion of the judgment of history work to appear to close off problems that in fact continue despite that? And what is it that is left out, what is left in, and so on and so forth. So that's that. And the other thing, I'm not sure, Gabriella, I mean, I have this is a crazy project, but I had to clean out my office because I have to move. Since I'm retired, I have to move to a smaller office. And so I had to sort all my papers through. And I'm one of these historians who kept every piece of paper before we had electronic. And I don't know what to do with electronic stuff, but between when I started to keep things, which was probably when I was in high school or college, until around 2000, everything was in paper. And so I had to go through these tons of paper and basically create my own archive. And I've written this little essay that's coming out in my journal, The History of the Present, which is called Archive Angst. What is it? What happens when a historian is creating her own archive? It's one thing for historians to go to the archives, and we know what all the limits of those archives are: state control, selective input, but what if it's your own stuff? What do you do about that? So that was one thing. But in the midst of all of these papers, there is a collection of letters from when I started college in 1958 to when I finished graduate school in 1969. So the 1960s. And I was extremely politically active in ban the bomb, civil rights, anti-war, anti-Vietnam War protests. And these letters are between me and my parents and my sister. And we wrote each other, there are hundreds of letters for this 11-year period. And the question is what to do with them and how to maybe use them to write something about my 1960s, but not as a memoir. I can't imagine writing a memoir. I mean, it's just too self-involved. But how to use them to sort of think maybe a set of different kinds of historical questions, like memory, the question of memory, the question of what sorts of values are transmitted from generation to generation, the question of continuity. Is that girl that I was in 1958 the necessary precursor to who I am now, or what's the story? Can I tell it as a singular narrative or something else? So those sorts, I mean, there are questions about how one thinks one's history in a very sort of personal way. And so that's sort of the project right now. Sometimes I think I'm just going to throw them all out, or all these letters, or give them to my children to laugh at, or whatever children and grandchildren do with their old parents' letters. But it's very interesting. And one of the interesting things about it is that I'm now older than anybody in these letters. In the letters, I'm as old or as young as my oldest grandchildren. And my parents are the age of my children. And so the sort of perspective by which one reads the writings of this other self or these other people at ages that are no longer do I identify with is also another really interesting and challenging kind of thing. So that's the project of the moment. And as I say, sometimes I think, maybe something better will come along and I won't have to do this at all. Or maybe it will be, there is some use that can be made of it. So that's sort of where I am.
I think I would certainly like to read that book.
Well, it'll be a series of disjointed essays. It's not going to be a book. a book, you know, a book. It's because I think different of these questions have to be approached differently. But we'll see. I mean, I don't, you know, it's, for me, it's a different kind of writing too, because I never write about myself if I can help it. So we'll see.
Well, regardless of format, it sounds just such a lovely project. If you guys agree, we have several questions from the audience.
Great.
So should we dig into them?
Sure.
I'm going to start with a question. I'm going to try to do my best at translating this from Spanish into English, because translation is really an art. So I hope I can be fair to what they're asking. Evelyn Aldaz wants to ask, how is the notion of secularism understood in your book? And also, what is the difference between secularism and laicidad, which is laicité, because Mexico is understood to be laico.
Right.
That avec laicité, I don't know how to say that in French.
Lay.
Okay.
Lay or laïque. So it's a very good question. We avoided it before because you did, Amneris, you raised it, and we sort of managed not to have to do it, or I managed not to have to do it. So ordinarily, laïcité means this careful or strict separation of church and state, that the church has no role in politics and the state is neutral in relation to religion. And secularism, or secularization more usually, is a sociological term that refers to the transformation of the kind of ethos of a society from one based in religion and other sorts of things to a kind of rational, bureaucratic, scientific approach to life. The giving up on transcendence, on the notion of some extra-human explanation for things, and the emphasis on human rationality as constructing life and society. So that's the distinction. In the book, I am less interested in that distinction than I am in the use of the term as discourse. So what I'm analyzing is not so much the phenomenon of state versus church, or the process of secularization. But what I'm interested in is how the notion of scientific, rational modernity, and certainly church versus state, or state versus church, is used to address questions about gender. How the appeals to a separation of church and state end up with women, what we talked about earlier, with women being identified with religion, sort of on that side. How the emphasis on science and nature as that which needs to be studied rather than God as the ultimate causality, nonetheless writes into research and into biology a hierarchical difference between the sexes. How in politics, the refusal of religious influences in the state also manages to keep women out as citizens and active political participants for hundreds of years. So it's as a kind of tool of power rather than as a sociological phenomenon that I use and address the question of secularism.
Okay, for the next questions, I wonder if you are familiar with the notion of gender ideology, because it's something that's been going on a lot in Latin America and in Mexico. So
Yeah.
if you are, then I will try to summarize the questions. This is for the whole panel. What do you think about these neoconservative groups that are fighting against everything that is considered gender ideology, and which is an upfront attack on feminism. And that is one question also from Evelyn, but we have a question on that note also from Saul Espino Armendaris, who talks about cultural wars. In cultural wars, there's a key term, fundamentalism, which is to refer either to charismatic evangelics or conservative Catholics in the Mexican context, or the Muslims in the French context. The word fundamentalism comes up several times in your book. How can we understand fundamentalism without reproducing myths that come from liberalism? Would you agree that classic laïcité is an example of liberal fundamentalism?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. Yeah. I mean, others can, Gabriela and Ali can answer too, but I would just say that whenever I talk about fundamentalism, I hope I talk about it as exactly what you're asking, that is, as a liberal characterization of unacceptable religious practice, not as my own characterization of those religious practices. And yes, I think that fundamentalism is part of the construction of the myth of liberalism as emancipatory, free, non-fundamentalist. So yeah, so that would be my answer to that. Maybe Ali and Gabriela, and then we can talk about gender ideology after that, if you guys have some other other thoughts about this. Gabriela?
No.
Ali?
Oh, yeah. Gender ideologies. I think I was thinking of the introduction to gender and the politics of history when you discuss how in the International Conference of Women, gender is in brackets.
Right.
In brackets. And it's still in bracket. Well, no, it's not in brackets anymore. That's why we have those gender ideology, the enemies of what they call gender ideology now.
Right. One of the things, you know, in French, between brackets is entre braguettes. And braguette in French is also a man's fly, the fly in a man's pants. And so I always thought there would be something wonderful you could do with that, you know, anyway. But no, I think the whole movement of the whole attempt to characterize gender as an ideology resonates with anti-communism of the 1950s. It's another way to sort of talk about an un-American or an un-French or an un-Mexican, whatever, a plot to somehow disrupt the natural order of things. And it's clearly, it comes from the church. I mean, the leadership comes from the Vatican, from when Benedict was Cardinal Ratzinger. He's the first to sort of go after it, and it remains part of church activity. And it's all over the world, or certainly all over the Western world. One of my favorite moments was in France during the debates about passage of the Marriage Act, the permitting gay marriage. There were groups out, mostly Catholic, but not only, groups out with huge signs that said "Non à l'idéologie de genre," no to gender ideology. And I thought, in what other country in the world but France would you have a public demonstration against an ideology? You know, it could be no to gay marriage, but non à l'idéologie de genre. And I thought, I have the poster from that, and I've always wanted to, you know, do something with that with that poster. But I think that it is a measure of the success, actually, of gender ideology, of our theories of gender, that has led to this concerted backlash. It's another form of backlash, and it has to do with the sense that the world will be overturned. The world as we know it will be overturned if gender is defined as a cultural construction, if gender is understood to be mutable and changeable to serve ideologies of power rather than reflect natural biological difference. So I think these are powerful concerted groups, but I think that they're a measure of our success rather than a major threat to the way. They're not going to turn us back unless, as you know, unless Trump wins the next election, unless politicians are in power who manage to do more than use this as a rhetorical trick to win votes, but who actually try to put it into effect, as is the case in Poland and some of the other Eastern European countries, Romania, where Hungary, where you're not allowed to teach gender in courses anymore, where there are laws that have outlawed the teaching of gender because it's disruptive to the natural order of things. So it's dangerous. But I do think that we have to think of it as a measure of our success, of the fact that, you know, despite all of this, gay marriage is acceptable in more and more places in the world, that the demand for women's equality, however unfulfilled, is taken seriously increasingly in places in the world. You know, I mean, what it means to sort of watch this movement of gender ideology come into being, I'm not sure how much traction it has and how far it can go, except, as I say, in the hands of authoritarian rulers who then pass laws that make it impossible for us to keep studying and teaching and researching these questions.
I like your optimism, Joan, which I share, and about this gender ideology. One of those groups has this motto that is, "Don't mess up with our kids." And they had this caravan traveling throughout Mexico. They had this orange buses, and one of their buses was repealed from one of the most, from a city that is traditionally considered as one of the most Catholic cities. The bus was burned. So I think you're right in a way that society won't take that sort of ideology unless politicians on the whole political spectrum sort of use those fears people have, societies have, unless politicians really use that to consolidate their power.
And I mean, I think unless the Republicans steal this election, there's no question that there's an overwhelming hostility to Trump, much of it on the grounds of his treatment of women, his hypermasculinity, there's the revulsion against what he represents and wants to do is enormous. Whether the Republicans can steal the election, which is a terrible possibility, but could happen, is another question. But what we think of as public opinion, it seems to me, is overwhelmingly on the side of Me Too, Black Lives Matter, greater equality for groups in society.
Yeah. Continuing on this discussion, there's a question from viewers on YouTube asking for your views on how the idea of secularism is associated or not with TERF feminism or conservative feminism, which seems to be closer to this religious discourses against gender ideology. Do you have any thoughts on that?
It seems to me, unless I misunderstand it, that the question answers itself, which is that their notion of gender is the one that we are criticizing. The conservative notion of gender, that is that it's about, it's the social roles that reflect biology. And the implication of that is that since biology doesn't change, social roles can't really change that much either, which is an entirely different perspective from the one that we would bring to it, in which we would say that gender is what defines sex and uses sex to legitimate itself, but in fact is a much more mutable and variable set of concepts or set of relationships than the conservatives would suggest it is.
Yeah, but it's funny now how extremes tend to touch upon each other. Like somehow they just go back to the same starting point, and that has to do with this determinism, biological determinism.
Yeah, and it being so grounded in, you know, in people's, when people will say things like, well, women are like this and men are like that, and I'll say, well, but, or talking about children, well, girls do this, boys do this, and then I say, well, but here's 4 different examples of the varieties of girlness or boyness that you could imagine, and people sort of, well, but there really is, you know, some underlying similarity, and the answer is there's not. The spectrum of possibility of enacting or performing, in Judith Butler's words, femininity and masculinity is, you know, enormous. And all you have to do is look and you see, or watch little kids and you see it.
I don't know if Ali and Gabriela want to say something on this.
No, I am looking at all the topics that we had thought about and see if we did our homework right.
Well, this is supposed to be a casual conversation, Gabriela. We didn't have homework.
Yeah, it's a soirée. We have a couple of questions that had to do a little bit more with method. Mm-hmm. One is asking if on this book, Joan, you used the concept, the notion of experience from a feminist perspective. I would say yes, but I don't know if you want to go further to develop.
Well, I have a whole article on experience that was published, I can't even remember now when, that has had a huge number of citations. It's the top 10 citations in critical inquiry in which it was published. So I think that experience is something that is also, we need to interrogate. It's something that we create to explain, or that there's not, I don't think there's kind of an experience without conceptualization. So what feminists are doing in talking about experience is conceptualizing their lives in terms of access or not to power, treatment as subordinate or not, and so on and so forth. So there's a set of stories that we can tell about our experience that fit them into certain ways of seeing or understanding. And you know, the great thing about the consciousness raising movement of the 1970s was that women came together and talked about their experience and rewrote it, re-understood it as subordination or exploitation, when before it was the way life had to be lived, even though they were unhappy living it. So there's something to say, and you know, psychoanalysis is another, or psychotherapy, for those of you who've done it, is another way of retelling the story of your life from a very different perspective from the one that you've been somehow understanding it to be. So I think experience is something that always is seen through a certain lens, and the lenses can change depending on the political movement that one becomes a part of, or the psychoanalysis that one undergoes, or you know, whatever it is. But it's not a transparent thing. I mean, maybe if you fall down the stairs, you know, or you hit your head, you can say, I hit my head. I mean, that level of experience, I will grant, can be accepted. But even that, whether it's how to understand what happened, did I do this to myself, you know, whatever, it seems to me is interpretable. If you think about little children, there are children who, when they fall, parents are always told not to say, are you all right, when a child falls, but just say, you fell. And children will interpret the experience of falling differently depending upon the reaction of the adults who are in charge of them. And so, you know, it's not that you don't have experiences, but that how you understand them and what they mean to you depend on the lens through which you see them.
Okay, then there's a question that says, you write about historical analysis, where you talk about it as as a critical term. In this sense, gender, how can we think about it in the future? I think you have said something about it, but maybe you could say a bit more. And also this question says, and how some trans collectives or trans groups or LGBTQIQ and queer groups make a critique of the category of gender. Could gender ever stop being a constitutive characteristic for societies? Just a small little question.
Well, see, it's what I don't understand about some trans critiques of gender. They take gender to be a fixed binary, right? That what gender is, they understand. It's what the sort of society in general says gender is, and has come to say gender is the fixed difference between men and women. So when you talk about the gender gap in voting, it's men, women. So it's definitely, there exists in popular discourse the notion that gender is simply a binary reference, and a binary reference to biology. And the critique of that by transgender seems to me not arguable with. That is that, but that's what some feminists have been doing all along. I mean, that's what I think of my work as doing when I started thinking about gender. That is, I don't think about it as a fixed binary opposition. I think about it as a set of questions about how binary oppositions are created and what work they are expected to do. And so in that sense, I read transgender as the continuation of that critical feminist work, saying, you know, hey, look at us. We are not inhabiting this binary world. And that has always been, it seems to me, one of the goals of certain kinds of critical feminist work, to insist that nothing about your body, well, anatomy is not determination, that the possibilities of inhabiting bodies have nothing to do with the roles assigned to them by the society. So I think of studying gender as a study of the norms that attempt to do a certain kind of work that psychoanalysis tells us they never can completely do. That is that always the desire, the fantasy life, the lived life of real people will exceed the rules established by the social norms that gender seeks to impose. So, yes, it's understandable that trans wants to do away with gender. On the other hand, if you think of gender as a critical category of analysis, then it's doing exactly what trans says it wants to do, which is to disrupt the binary and call it into question as an incontrovertible reality with which we will always have to live.
I don't know if Gabriela and Ali want to say something on this.
If I understood your intervention correctly, you're saying that this position is not understanding gender as a tool for
Critical analysis.
For thinking something that is part of culture, that is part of power relations, but that is not, and that is embodied, but in many ways. And
Yes,
not
exactly. That's exactly right.
Established way.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That it's a tool of critical analysis, not a description of necessary reality.
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe talking in the terms of your book again, I think the notion of gender that most of these groups take query with would probably be precisely a liberal, secularized notion of gender, right? Of like who's who in this secular sort of Western type of society that we're aspiring to, that is in many ways limited, yes, because of the things you say in the book, precisely, of how it is assimilated to sexual freedom in a very limited way as well.
Right.
And this sort of political equality in a very liberal, limited
binary way. Yeah.
We're about to finish our lovely conversation, but there's one question that we cannot get away with. This one comes from the comments on YouTube, and what do you think about the upcoming election in the US? And what do you think about Kamala Harris?
Well, the coming election, I have nightmares about every night. I mean, you can't imagine, because you've certainly lived through terrible times, but it's very hard to, these next 3 weeks are just like terrifying to witness, because it's not only that Trump is more and more out of control as he desperately wants to save himself from defeat, but that the Republicans are enabling him, and in the name of protecting the vote from fraud, committing the most awful kinds of fraud and voter suppression that you can imagine. In Texas, there are these boxes to collect ballots that have been set up. There's one per county in every county in Texas, which means millions of people will have to drive to some place to put their ballots in a box if they want to do it. There's the question of whether the post office is reliable under a postmaster general that Trump appointed, who has been looking in every way possible to suppress the vote. There is 2 days ago, the Supreme Court ruled in Trump's favor to stop counting for the census earlier than the Census Bureau wanted to. And this is because this won't affect this election, but it'll affect future elections, because the numbers of people particularly in urban areas who won't get counted will affect the allocation of seats in the Congress in future elections. The Republicans in California have been putting up these fake collection boxes, and who knows what they're going to do with them. I mean, it's the voter fraud that they're afraid of is in fact what they're perpetrating. And so even if, as the polls suggest, there's a good possibility of Biden winning, how the lawsuits that they're in, at every turn, there's a lawsuit. Every time a governor tries to do something, there's a lawsuit to prevent it from happening. So to the extent that, so there's that, the one is just the question of voter suppression and voter fraud on the part of the Republicans, which is being practiced in many Republican states with Republican governors and Republican legislatures and so on. So there's that. The second thing is the Electoral College and you know, all of that. But the third is the violence that will be unleashed whether Trump wins or loses. And he has been signaling to these armed militia groups, which are small but nonetheless violent and visible, that they're going to have to help him win if he loses. And so even if he's declared a loser, what will happen in the streets of some cities is unknowable. And I think the real fear of violence is enormous. Some of us keep saying this may be the only country, the only democracy in the world in which we look to the military to save us from an authoritarian ruler. But it may come to that. So it's really as worrisome as it's ever been, wow. and unpredictable. Kamala Harris, I think she's fine. I mean, you know, Biden is fine. I mean, those are not my candidates. Those are not the people I would, in an ideal world, want to run this country. But they will be fine. And I think, in fact, having a Black woman running for vice president is a very important gesture to Black voters, to a moment of, you know, Black Lives Matter and all of this protest about police violence and so on and so forth. So I think that, you know, she's more charismatic than Biden is, but charisma is not the issue in this election. I mean, being as calm and sort of even as you possibly can be is probably a better antidote to Trump than some other charismatic person, you know, shouting and proclaiming his or her particular viewpoint. So, but I think the only real thing I can say is that it's with enormous anxiety that most of us are just not knowing how to think the next weeks and dreading what could happen however the election turns out. And that's, again, something that this country has never faced before. I mean, that Bush versus Gore was a steal of the election, but it was a peaceful transition of power. This is not going to be that. And, you know, I hope I'm wrong. I hope that, you know, my pessimism is not overwhelming.
I suppose you live in a blue state, don't you?
I do. I live in a blue state. And I voted. We have paper ballots, what do you call it, mail ballots, and I put mine in a reputable box the other day. So I have voted. I have a little button that says I voted. I do live in a blue state. But even in this, you know, in these blue states, there are these pockets of militias that are extremely dangerous and well organized, and can, you know, who knows how they'll decide they have to help protect Trump against a coup d'etat. You know, you just, the material he's giving them by which to underscore and mobilize their fantasies is daily very disturbing. So that's the news from USA.
Yeah. On a brighter note, we would like to thank you, John, for your time and for your book and all your work throughout the years. Really, we are so honored to having you here. And also I want to thank Ali and Gabriela for their thoughts. And maybe in order to have some concluding remarks in a brighter note, I would like each one of you to say something about Joan's book, and then we can just say goodbye to our audience. Maybe Ali, would you like to begin?
Sure. Well, just again, I'm really glad we had this opportunity to have this conversation. I'm so happy I was invited. Very nice meeting you, John, and thank you very much for your insight today. I really enjoyed your book, and I'm really looking forward to that one on your letters from the youth.
My life.
Sounds amazing. Sounds amazing.
Thanks.
Please.
I also want to thank Joan for her work and to invite everybody to look beyond is gender a category of analysis, because Joan has a fascinating body of work. Some books are in Spanish, 3 books are in Spanish, but she also has published enormously in journals. The experience article was mentioned early. It was translated into Spanish. It is in La Ventana, if somebody is interesting. And nobody asked me what my view for the future was, but my view for the future in the context of this presentation, of this book launching, is that Joan gets more readers in Spanish language for this and the other books, and that we eventually prepare a reader with selected works that are up to now not available in Spanish. Not that I have spoken to anybody about this. It's not something my institution knows. It's just myself, but I just want to say it in public because we're speaking our hearts out in front of the computer. Thank you for all your work, and Mary's.
And I just want to say thank you to all of you for that. This is a wonderful conversation. I didn't know what it was going to be like, but I really enjoyed it enormously. The only thing better, as I said at the beginning, would have been there with you in Mexico to do it. And I really appreciate the way in which my work has been translated, and the care that's been taken, and the beauty by which, as this book is an indication, the beauty that is sort of created in the actual product, the object itself. So thank you very much. It's been an honor for me to be part of this, and maybe we'll have future conversations.
Absolutely. Thank you so much to Joan, Ali, and Gabriela. And for those asking where they can get the book, please go to, I'm going to say this in Spanish, el Departamento de Publicaciones, tanto del CIEG como del Colmex. Ahí ya está en venta el libro. Sabemos que estamos en pandemia, por lo que es importante enviar un correo para que ahí les puedan dar indicaciones sobre cómo acceder a este maravilloso libro. And then, well, on behalf of Pierre and CIEG, I would like to thank all those involved in making this presentation possible, in particular Cristina Herrera, Ceci Olivares, the tech, the publishing and communications teams from both Colmex and CIEG, our interpreter, Flor Moreno, and of course, again, a big, big thank you to Joan, Gabriela, and Alice. And we'll see you soon. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye now.
Un gusto, Gabriela. Cuídate mucho.
Ciao.
Bye.
Bye.